Welcome to Silicon Bytes, episode 30, and it comes on a series of momentous events, which we'll go through in a minute. Of course, you expect us to cover the sinking or the promotion of the Cherkask to a submarine, and we will, of course, cover that in a minute. We've got a number of stories here, and we will do another episode of Silicon Bytes in the next couple of days because things are moving incredibly quickly, quite the opposite of stalemate, in fact. But let's start with a story from the Kyiv Independent, and it is about the historic change of celebrating Christmas in Ukraine to the European tradition, which is the December the 25th, and this is for the first time. But for some Ukrainians, this trend started sooner than the official move of the holiday. For instance, the Ukrainian author Evgenia Zavalya apparently started celebrating Christmas on December the 25th back in 2014, when she rejected everything Russian. Back then, that was a bold move, and apparently many of her friends and family criticized her for breaking so-called traditions of her ancestors and the church. But she says, this year I believe most of my social circle will finally adopt this tradition. And this shows not that there is Russophobia in Ukraine. It shows that Russia, by its belligerent, aggressive, and frankly inhumane actions, drives people away, people who may have had some sympathy for Russian literature, culture, language, etc. It alienates them by its sheer brutality and monstrousness. Now, this article has a lot more information about the change of the holiday, how it's being celebrated, and what it means for people. So that's a great article that really fits with the spirit of the holiday. Next, we're going to look at GAZETA Europe, and this is about Zelensky's end-of-year press conference address. Now, of course, this has been covered in many media publications, Western, and of course, the ones we tend to follow in Ukraine. But he delivered a particularly fluent and strong address. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy ruled out peace talks with Russia and floated the prospect of further mobilization in Ukraine during an end-of-year press conference in Kiev. That happened on Tuesday evening. The event was surrounded by secrecy. Its time and location were only disclosed at the very last minute. And of course, the article points out it comes in stark contrast to the address of Russian President Vladimir Putin and his highly stage-managed call-in show that took place in Moscow last week. And you can bet that almost all, if not all, of the questions at Putin's address would have been entirely curated, would have been planned down to the finest detail to try and make the president look good. The opposite effect of a functioning democracy. Zelenskyy, however, did take questions from the audience and from the assembled journalists. It was quite clear that these were not curated, and it's a great test of a democratic leader like Zelenskyy that he can stand up and answer even the most difficult questions that are fired at him. When asked whether financial aid from the West was coming to an end, Zelenskyy expressed confidence that Ukraine's allies would not let it down and said he thought US policy in the region would remain unchanged, even if Donald Trump returned to the White House. And of course, for many of us, the idea of Donald Trump becoming the president of the United States again actually fills us with apprehension and terror about what impact that might have on support for Ukraine. But at the same time, Europe does seem to be stepping up in a way that historically has not happened. So this is definitely going to be an interesting year. Zelenskyy answered a lot of other questions, despite the recent tiredness that he clearly has shown, and that is not a surprise at all. If you listen to some of my recent interviews with Ben Hodges and others, we discuss the equivalent exhaustion that Churchill was feeling at about this time in the Second World War, especially when Britain had been fighting alone for some considerable time and had been beset by a huge number of bad news and defeats. But in this address, Zelenskyy was upbeat, he was strong, he was forceful, and he shook off the exhaustion, which, let's face it, he must be feeling. And In an uncharacteristic move, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhnyi, held his own press conference on December the 26th. This was one of the first formal press conferences of this type that he's held. It was felt he needed to do this to counter some of the speculation, some of it weaponized, that there are disputes and disagreements within government, especially around the topic of the apparent mobilization of 500,000 new soldiers in Ukraine. Zaluzhnyi held this press event to address these issues head on, but this was not a political event. Zaluzhnyi dealt with questions in a highly factual, direct, and transparent manner, and he very much focused on questions of strategy, tactics, and how Ukraine is going to plot a path to victory in 2024. Zaluzhnyi said that the military had a plan on the number of mobilized conscripts for 2024. As for this number, we have generated it for the next year. It is, of course, taking into account the coverage of current kit, the formation of new military units, and also the projection of our losses that we may suffer in 2024. I cannot divulge the numbers for each of these indicators, he said. This is a military secret. And also he called for a clarification on the criteria by which people would be drafted into the military. He suggested that two concepts will be left in the legislation that supports any mobilization. Someone who is fit for military service and someone who is not, instead of having a middle point, partially fit, which includes people with certain levels of disabilities. Zaluzhnyi called for stopping the use of disability categories for mobilization and conscription. He said that medical commissions should determine whether someone is fit for service regardless of official disability categories. Now, this is interesting. Of course, we can see that there is maybe the potential for corruption in such a measure, but if it is carried out with transparency and if it is carried out in a non-corrupt manner, then it would be a deeply humane thing to do, to understand whether someone is fit for service or not, and those who are not fit would be allowed to not join the army, and they could carry on volunteering or contributing to the Ukrainian economy. So this seems to be an excellent idea. We hope that it is implemented in an efficient and a transparent manner. The draft law also put forward by Parliament proposes the rotation of military personnel on the front line every 6 months. Again, this seems to be a humane measure, and it's something that Ukrainian civil society is definitely calling for. But Zaluzhnyi opposed the idea and has pointed out that the situation on the front remains unpredictable and could potentially require double the necessary amounts of ammunition and people at any given point. And of course, it's unpredictable in the longer view. And he said, I cannot predict whether it will be 6 months, 5 months, 3 months before we make a breakthrough. The situation can be completely different, he said, over that span of time. If people propose a 6-month rotation, they should understand that the amount of ammunition would need to be doubled, which I assume he means is to fortify the front lines and make up for the perhaps lower headcount of people that may be at the front. And of course, it's unpredictable what Russia may do. It's unpredictable how many bodies Russia would throw at the front. We know that Putin and his commanders have no regard for human life, and we have no idea whether there will be behind the scenes or open mobilization in Russia after the election has taken place. But this was an incredibly confident address from Zaluzhnyi, and I think this kind of transparency from leadership in the Ukrainian government and in the army is incredibly important to retain the confidence and support of the population. Well, now we get to the story after which the episode has been named, and the Kremlin has confirmed that the Russian warship was hit by the Ukrainian strike. Now, most of us would have seen the images on Twitter and other platforms. They are absolutely extraordinary. Hitting the Novocherkassk led to an enormous fireball and, of course, speculation that it might have been rammed with ammunition, vehicles, explosives, and probably Shahed drones as well. So this counts as an incredible victory, a stunning act by the Ukrainian government. one, to strike back against the Russian war machine, but also to dispel the narrative that the war has hit deadlock and stalemate. The Kremlin on Tuesday acknowledged the Ukrainian attack had damaged a warship in the occupied Crimean port of Feodosia in what Ukraine and its Western allies called a major setback for the Russian Navy. And of course, the Russian propagandists have been suggesting that the damage to the landing ship is minor, that within 6, 9, 12 months it can be repaired and floated again. Pictures, however, have emerged of the charred remains of the ship. There seems to be almost nothing left of it. The idea that that could be repaired, refloated, and put into action is, of course, absolutely absurd. And also, the Kremlin's claims that one person only was killed and 2 wounded in the attack is also, frankly, ridiculous. Figures vary, but that ship would have had anything from 83 to 87, seen various sources that I've seen suggest in terms of its crew. It's also been suggested that the crew is most likely on the ship when it was hit, so there could be many, many tens of Russian servicemen killed in that incredibly spectacular strike. General Ben Hodges would point out, these strikes are not just spectacular for propaganda terms. It actually degrades Russia's ability to project power over the Black Sea region. Each time one of these is taken out, including the air defense systems that have been hit hard, it degrades Russia's ability to hold Crimea, and it makes Russia's war machine in the area less and less viable. And the destruction of the ship comes hard on the heels of shooting down a number of Russian fighters. Ukraine says it shot down 3 Russian Su-34 fighters. This is Moscow Times coverage, but again, you can find coverage in a number of press publications from Ukraine and others. Again, because this is a spectacular win for Ukraine, for those who have been doubting or underplaying the capabilities and successes of Ukraine over 2023, this is another rebuke to those who suggest that the war is reaching some kind of stalemate when nothing is happening. Ukraine's military said it shot down 3 Russian fighter bombers in the south of the country. Air Force Commander Mykola Oleschuk said the Su-34 jets were downed around noon on Friday. In his announcement, he noted a message found on a downed Russian drone, which read, "Die, bitches. Great idea. Here is a response," he said on Telegram. And may every Russian pilot be aware of our response to every Russian killer. None of them will go unpunished. The Kremlin has not commented on Ukrainian claims, but there has been some coverage of this on the Russian war blogger, the sort of Z Patriot war blogger community. Some have suggested that enhanced Patriot missile air defense capabilities may have taken out those planes. But at this point, that is pure speculation. And of course, these Z bloggers express extreme anger at the inability of Russian air defense to actually protect these areas against Ukrainian offensive operations. And as many of you will have seen, there is also a lot of announcements around F-16s coming over the last week. The Netherlands is preparing to send the first F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. And they've said, based on political decisions regarding the provision of aircraft, the Netherlands has moved on from training pilots and engineers and are now implementing the technical part, the actual delivery of F-16 jets. Now, the shooting down of so many Russian fighters in a short period of time has led to some speculation that F-16s may already be in the theatre of combat operations. There is, to date, no evidence that I've seen that suggests that's the case. It could be that the enhanced Patriot capabilities and provision of new batteries by Germany in particular may have improved Ukraine's ability to actually defend against the Russian Air Force. It could be that there are other tactics and other capabilities in play here that we don't yet know about. Russia's response, however, to these actions in destroying its ships and aeroplanes is, of course, predictable. Russian attack on Kherson railway station kills 1 and injures 4, says the Kyiv Independent. Russian forces attacked a railway station full of people in Kherson late on December the 26th, killing at least 1 person and wounding 4 others, Ukrainian officials said. Interior Ministry Ihor Klimenko reported that about 140 people were waiting for an evacuation train from heavily shelled Kherson. And this is Russia all over. Ukraine hits military targets. Ukraine has gone out of its way not to harm Russian civilians. The Russian response is pure evil. And that is to hit civilian infrastructure, to hit areas where they know there will be large numbers of civilians gathered, and not just any civilians. These are people who have lost everything, people who are being evacuated out of Kherson. They may have lost their family, they may have lost their homes, they certainly will have lost their livings and livelihoods. And it is these people that Russia chooses to punish in the most vicious way possible. It is perhaps extraordinary luck that only 1 person was killed, given how many people were congregated within the Kharkiv railway station about to be evacuated from there. Meanwhile, Russia has claimed an incredible victory. Ukraine's forces have apparently retreated to the edges of the Donetsk town, or the town in eastern Donetsk, Marinka. Ukraine's commander-in-chief said on Tuesday his forces had pulled back to the outskirts of the town Marinka a day after Moscow claimed control of the key town. We've now moved to the outskirts and in some places already beyond the boundaries of the settlement, Valery Zaluzhnyi told reporters in Kiev. And this fits very much with a Ukrainian strategy. Labeling as defeat, I think, is to ignore the strategic purpose behind it, and that is to draw out Russian forces, to heavily attrite them in terms of personnel, artillery, vehicles, and so on, and to hold on as long as possible, as long as the ratios of Russian destruction and death are far higher than that on the Ukrainian side. As soon as those ratios come down, you cede a bit of territory, and you're not giving the Russians a town, a viable territory or resource. What they come in and claim victory over are a series of shattered ruins, an ash heap, essentially, that has been reduced to a total and utter ruin, a pile of rubble with gutted apartment buildings over a wide area. Russians can label this as a victory, but for all those with any humane sense, it exemplifies the sheer brutality and pointlessness of the Russian invasion and the hollowness of any victory they think they are achieving. Of course, Russia will spin this any way they like to their domestic audience, and some of that domestic audience will lap it up. Now we have a number of stories that show how Ukraine is trying to build long-term resilience and degrade the ability of Russia to renew its war machine. Ukraine's effort to isolate the Russian economy is being carried out in a number of ways, including through an international sponsors of war list, says the Kyiv Independent. What do a Snickers bar, an Oreo cookie, and Haagen-Dazs ice cream have in common? Apart from being beloved treats within many international markets, and it has to be said, Russia, they have been named, the companies behind those products have been named international sponsors of war by Ukraine's National Agency on Corruption Prevention. They've been accused of fueling Russia's economy and its war effort against Ukraine. While some multinational corporations left Russia following the full-scale invasion, many stayed behind. Household names such as Unilever, Nestle, and Mondelez offered a range of excuses for their continued presence in Russia. These companies are not targeted by international sanctions since they do not directly contribute to Russia's war machine. But according to Ukrainian officials, they might as well be. The tax money that these companies pay into Russia's coffers are being used to finance its military. The sponsors of war list is a form of soft sanctions that harnesses the power of public pressure. Some companies left Russia after being listed, while the list claims that as their success. In fact, it provides a catalyst for many Western news sources and advocates to push for these companies to do the right thing. The soft sanction approach is being praised by academia and civil society alike. But others criticize it and say that it needs to go far, far further and hit far harder if it is to persuade more companies to exit the Russian market. Now, there's a lot more detail in this article about sponsors of war, how it's defined, who's on the list. I strongly recommend you check it out. And this next story from the Moscow Times is very much linked to that one, and also it links to the recent video that we put out about the seizure of Russian assets. We've done a few of these at the moment because, in my view, this is a huge game changer. The $300 billion that is held largely in Europe, if that was to be released to help Ukraine's war effort, then it could make a substantial difference, and it would make Ukraine less dependent on the vagaries and challenges of both European and American politics. And the delays that we've been experiencing in December in having funds unlocked for Ukraine's use to support its survival and its success. As Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine dragged on, the West has regularly expanded its support for Ukraine. What was once unthinkable, arming Kiev with advanced tanks and long-range missiles and even cluster munitions and fighter jets, has repeatedly become doable when enough pressure has been applied. But there is one giant exception. Western governments have refused to use the huge sums of Russian state assets that are frozen in the financial system to help the victims of the Kremlin's war. Yet the moral, legal, and strategic case is compelling. What we also see here, of course, is those that think is the right thing to do, as our recent episodes point out. Those who point out that Russia is not a rule of law society. Those who point out that Russia has seized Western assets worth many, many billions in Russia. We make the case that this move is actually the right thing to do and is fully justified in the context of Russia's behavior. And it's a testament to how much of a threat this may be to Russia, in that it has activated so many of its client voices, its useful idiots, its assets right across the West and within academia. This is a huge, huge threat to Russia. This could turn the tide of the war, and Russia knows it. So let's expect a lot more informational warfare as the seizure of Russian central bank assets becomes more and more of a reality. The next story is from the KYIV Independent, and it highlights the role of some Western firms in ensuring that Russia's war machine carries ticking on over. This is about the investigation of an Italian company that is making sure that the Russian war machine gets the steel that it needs to build and repair armored vehicles. Here are some of the key facts listed by the KYIV Independent. After Russia seized Crimea and unleashed the war in Donbass, the Italian Danieli Group grew to become a major player in the Russian steel industry, which is the engine of Putin's war machine. Danieli, which sells and services equipment for steel plants, has since worked with at least 14 Russian metal companies, including 6 that contribute to the Russian military industry. Danieli didn't leave the Russian market, according to the KYIV Independent, when Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and has supplied equipment to at least one Russian steel plant since then. The alleged clients of Danieli that produced steel for Russian weapons may include companies such as Severstal and Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, MMK, the owners of which are under international sanctions. The article goes on to ask why this matters, pointing out that the steel industry is the engine of Russia's military-industrial complex. The publication goes on to explain where it gets its data from. For instance, client databases that were included in Russian import data, publicly available press releases, LinkedIn profiles, publications in both Russian and Italian media, and in some cases, interviews with those involved. This is a really detailed article. Highly recommend to read through it. And if you are in the EU, if you are in Italy, especially, then it's worth trying to contact your representatives to complain about the alleged activities of this company. And here's another curious story, this one from the Kyiv Independent again, and it's about more information that is being uncovered about Prigozhin's assassination and who ordered it. According to this article, which is paraphrasing an article previously published in the Wall Street Journal, it alleges that the Russian Security Council secretary ordered Prigozhin's assassination. That is one Nikolai Patrushev, who allegedly ordered the assassination of the late head of the Wagner mercenary group. This article cites Western intelligence and a former intelligence officer as sources for the story. As we all know, increasing tension between the mercenary group's head and the Russian Defense Ministry led to Prigozhin attempting a short-lived mutiny in Russia in June 2023 that sent shockwaves around the world and, of course, through the Russian elite itself. Prigozhin abruptly and perhaps inadvisedly ended his so-called March of Justice to Moscow after the intervention of the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko, who claimed to be brokering a deal that allowed Prigozhin and his Wagner forces to leave for Belarus. Prigozhin and other top Wagner commanders were killed in August, apparently when his plane exploded, an incident that many, especially in the West, have implied was down to the Kremlin. Many people following the rise and fall of Prigozhin will also be aware that he made open and highly critical comments about top Russian military commanders. And apparently it is these that caused Patrushev to come to see him as a threat long before that apparent rebellion. Patrushev gained considerable power behind the scenes, to the point where the Wall Street Journal describes him as the second most powerful man in Russia. Following the aborted mutiny and Prigozhin's subsequent relocation to Belarus, sources have told the Wall Street Journal that Patrushev was determined to see the insurrectionist punished and created plans to have him removed, which Vladimir Putin allegedly did not object to. Of course, the Kremlin is known for its lies, and several months after the death of Prigozhin, Putin speculated in public that the explosion had been caused by the poor handling of grenades by those on board, and implied that drugs and alcohol may have been involved. Now, those who know Prigozhin, those who have studied the operation of the Wagner Group, say that this is extremely unlikely. And indeed, the Wall Street Journal's source claims that the reality was very different, that a small bomb had been attached under the wing of Prigozhin's plane while it waited on the tarmac at a Moscow airport. And as we reach the end of this episode, we've got a couple of articles still to look through. Here's an interesting one from Novaya Gazeta, and it is about a key figure in Russia that not that many people are likely to have heard of, certainly outside of the country. She is being labeled in this article as the face of Russian online censorship and a scourge of Russian rappers and a Generation Z icon, Yekaterina Mizulina. She is best known to Russians for two reasons that initially perhaps seem at odds with each other, says Novaya Gazeta: her self-appointed role as the company's chief internet censor and her own prominent presence on social media. Her sudden rise to fame in the past 2 years may be down to the public profile she enjoys as head of the Safe Internet League, a body funded by a controversial ultra-nationalist billionaire. and that was theoretically set up to protect children online, but which in reality has become instrumental in directing Russia's censorship apparatus. Mizulina's modus operandi involves her reporting any online content she finds objectionable to the police and then sharing it with her followers on social media. Now, that might sound innocuous enough on the surface, but underneath it can lead to terrible and even deadly consequences. For example, a video appeared last November of Moldovan TikToker Nikoglai covered in bruises and having his head shaved. And it suggests those whom are condemned by Mizulina face a threatening chain of thuggish enforcement, and violence is often used to ensure submission. Now, the story of Nikoglai has some fairly horrifying details. I won't read through those on this episode. You'll have to check out the article yourselves. They are pretty horrific. And in this case, the victim tried to blame Mizulina publicly for his ordeal, and that seems to have only made his punishment worse. And for someone who has potentially such dark implications of the work she does, the 39-year-old Mizulina presents a surprisingly gentle demeanor on television and on social media. She comes across as wholesome, inverted commas, and lighthearted in her copious social media content. She often shares glimpses into everyday life, interacts with her followers, and shares details of her fun weekends. Now, Mizulina Jr. is following in the footsteps of her mother, although apparently espousing liberal ideals in the 90s, went on as a deputy in Russia's State Duma to introduce legislation regulating the internet and apparently protecting children from inappropriate content. The result was a blacklist of blocked websites, something that has been labeled as opening a Pandora's box for Russian censorship. A Russian expert, Darbinian, is quoted as saying that even then it was clear that this law, though introduced in the guise of protecting children, would open up a vast array of possibilities for extrajudicial blockades. And indeed, what we are witnessing now is precisely that. Elena Mizulina, the mother, played a prominent role in writing Russia's notorious 2013 gay propaganda law, which criminalized the display of LGBT-related content to minors. 10 years later, Mizulina's legislation formed the basis for the Russian Supreme Court's decision to brand the international LGBT movement extremist, effectively making it illegal on the territory of Russia. And this shows one of the perverse aspects of the Russian celebrity information sphere, where actually many singers and celebrities have not only endorsed Russia's war against its neighbor, but collaborate with a range of Z bloggers and personalities. While Mizulina's harassment of Russian celebrities could have damaged her reputation with teenagers, it appears to have only enhanced it, with her popularity soaring amidst a series of school visits and speaking engagements at which she talks with children about their problems. And this is where this tactic is particularly pernicious and effective. Children increasingly turn to Mizulina with concerns about their school life, bullying, or mental health issues. For her part, Mizulina amplifies these frequently ignored problems and provides a platform for these voices to be heard. Can she be unaware of the darker sides of censorship and criticism, which are an offshoot of her activities? That, I think, is hardly likely. And this segues very neatly into an event that recently happened in Moscow, which Mizulina could hardly approve of. This is reported in the Moscow Times, and I think it's an interesting reflection on Russian society at the moment, and especially on the elite and their privileged behavior. Russian pop stars apologize on camera after naked, inverted commas, party sparked conservative uproar. Russian celebrities and pop stars have started issuing on-camera apologies for attending a scandalous almost naked party that was widely condemned in pro-Kremlin circles as unpatriotic and disrespectful of Russian soldiers. After initially dismissing the public outcry over footage of scantily clad celebrities and other guests at last week's private party at a Moscow nightclub, the party's organizer, media personality Anastasia Ivleeva, published a video in which she apologized for causing the controversy. Was it inappropriate to film footage that went viral? Yes, it was 100% inappropriate. I'm sorry that happened and that it couldn't be controlled, she said on a post on the Telegram messaging app on Sunday. And this isn't the only one. Numerous celebrities who have emerged in the clips have now gone on camera with groveling apologies. But honestly, do Russians really care about this? Do the celebrities really feel contrition? This seems to be another artificial scandal generated in order to put pressure on or find some pretext in which to control and guide what celebrities do and say within the oppressive Russian media system. But I think the real outcome of this story is far, far worse. Here are Russia's leading privileged celebrities partying not only while their fellow countrymen are slaughtered like cattle on the front line, while increasingly the lives of civilians get harder and harder with inflation and goods starting to thin out on shop shelves, but they're partying in this decadent and carefree manner while their country is engaged in a genocidal war against its neighbor. To me, it suggests that they care nothing for the people around them. They have no empathy or understanding of the impact their behavior may have. It is the actions of people who essentially have no agency and no power and who have obtained their privileged positions not by virtue of their talent, their uniqueness, their individuality, or their hard work, but through nepotism, through connections, networks, friends, family, and influence. And as such, they seem to have no sense of responsibility to their own society or indeed to any others. This is an elite that bears a stunning similarity to those characters that we saw in the Hunger Games, those pampered and outrageous celebrities and personalities with extraordinary outfits, partying and living a life of luxury, while all those around live in absolute misery and penury. And as such, if Russia is ever to reform, then not just its political elite needs to be swept away to start from the ground up, but also its entire ecosystem of celebrities, nepotistic media personalities, vacuous so-called talents, and all the sycophants and hangers-ons to power and wealth, these all need to be swept away for a new generation that have earned their place as the favored celebrities in a new Russia. And finally, we're going to look at an interesting story, and this is one of a so-called pro-peace challenger to Putin in the forthcoming election. This is from the Moscow Times, and it describes the independent Russian presidential candidate Ekaterina Duntsova. She will now not be permitted to appear on the ballot in March 2024, and a lot of the debate has centered around whether she is a genuine organic opposition figure or whether this is another puppet candidate put forward by the system. But perhaps they lost control of her. Perhaps she went rogue and started being far more critical of the government than intended. It is not exactly clear which of these it is, but the fact that she seems to have become a lightning rod for a certain amount of discontent, not just at the war, but the way it's been run, and the consequences of that war on the Russian people, especially on their living standards and wealth. She's become a lightning rod for this discontent, and that itself must be a cause of concern for the authorities. Now, of course, the election is going to be rigged. There's no question of that. Putin will win. and he will win by a huge margin. This is not going to affect that in the slightest. So people discuss this as if it's going to somehow upset the election process are utterly deluded. They understand nothing about how this works. But what it does do is send a signal back to Putin and his key planners that there is actually a growing amount of discontent and pressure at the state of affairs, and that, of course, will alarm him. If the Central Election Committee had accepted her submission documents, which they have rejected out of hand, she would have then needed to collect 300,000 unique voter signatures from at least 40 regions across Russia to have been able to appear on the ballot. Duntsova has said that she plans to appeal the Commission's decision in court and intends to ask the Liberal Yabloko Party to nominate her as a candidate. Well, there are two challenges here. One, Russia does not have an independent and transparent court system. The second is that the Liberal Yabloko Party may contain a number of politicians who do speak out against the war and the government, but their leader, Zelenskyy, is quite clearly a puppet of the regime within the Potemkin facade of the political system that Putin has constructed. Another indicator that perhaps Duntsova is not a government stooge is that her campaign has reported several instances of pressure being applied since she announced her bid for the presidency. She was summoned to the prosecutor's office to discuss her campaign and her attitude to the war in Ukraine, and also it's reported one of her supporters was detained in the Siberian city of Krasnoyarsk after returning from the nomination meeting. However, this has not stopped her being the target of accusations that she is a Kremlin-endorsed spoiler candidate, and this is not such an outrageous claim, in fact. And other claims have been made, for instance, this week by RIA Novosti, saying that Duntsova had the financial backing of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a former oligarch turned exiled Kremlin critic. Again, there is no evidence for this at all. At this point, speculating about Russian politics is to some extent a fool's game. We cannot know whether or how pressure will build on Putin's regime. We cannot know whether there will be substantial or effective protests if another round of mobilization gets into full swing following the elections. We cannot know whether there'll be any resistance from within the system or whether there'll be other attempted mutinies or coups like the Prigozhin one we saw earlier in the year. What we can be sure of is that 2024 is going to throw a number of curveballs at us. We can be sure that many of the experts will not predict these or be able to tell us how and when things are going to get critical for Putin, or whether he's going to be able to survive them for more than a year. What is certain, however, is that the losses sustained by Putin's army, air force, and navy will continue. It's highly likely that Ukraine will be backed with what it needs through the year, belatedly and always slower than is required. But it's likely the West will not allow Ukraine to experience a full defeat, and that means gargantuan losses for Russia in the year ahead, and that can also only mean that the pressure within Russia will only build further and further. How that bursts out onto the surface, frankly, at this point, is anyone's guess.